Calling out to the wolf pack. This is Call of the Wild with Danielle Lewis. We're here to finish up the DNC class action lawsuit transcripts. When we left off, we had talked about the Wimes case and we had talked about the Lafayette case, and Mr. Spiva was spewing his nonsense about how apparently the American courts have no jurisdiction over political parties. Now, I think we should end Mr. Spiva in rare form and move on to Mr. Beck. So, Mr. Spiva, that's for the party to decide. The court's not going to get into that. Here you have something far more inchoate, Your Honor, which is purported this claim that the party acted without even-handedness and impartiality. That even to define what constitutes even-handedness and impartiality really would already drag the court well into a political question and a question of how the party runs its own affairs. The party could have favored a candidate. I'll put it that way. Maybe that's a better way of answering Your Honor's question. Even if it were true, that's the business of the party, and it's not justicable. Mr. Spiva, again, is very well paid. So we are going to move on to Mr. Beck's response to this dreck. Mr. Beck, Your Honor, I am shocked to hear that we cannot define what it means to be even-handed and impartial. If that were the case, we couldn't have courts. I mean, that's what the courts do every day. It decides disputes in an even-handed and impartial manner. So to me, it's not a difficult question at all what it means to be even-handed and impartial. It doesn't mean having to wade into a political dispute about how the party conducts its affairs, because that's what the party represented in its own charter. That's what the party represented over and over again in the media. That's frankly what I think is the bedrock of what it means to live in a democratic society. I think that's why the Democratic National Committee had it in its charter. Because if you don't have an organization that is responsible for organizing, in this very large sense, the nominating process for president, which entails multiple elections in every state of the union, if you're not even-handed and impartial, then you don't have a democratic process. And I think what it means is the Democratic National Committee should not be putting any resources into one candidate at the expense of another. I think it means that it should not be assisting the media in crafting narratives that hurt one candidate at the expense of another. I think it means that when there's a dispute that comes up in one of the primaries, say Nevada, where there are allegations of misbehavior during a primary event, I think it means the DNC should not be picking sides and should be adjudicating those disputes in a fair and even-handed manner. This is not a difficult thing at all to decide. I think the language speaks for itself in many ways. And so again, I'll say it again. They keep citing cases where plaintiffs have brought grievances that are political in nature. And now they're starting to use this defense of justicability, which is, interestingly, I don't think a particular defense as phrased appear anywhere in their papers. I may be missing something, but I don't see how this is a political question. What page am I on? There we are. We are not asking this court, there we are, we're not asking this court to infringe on the province of another branch of its government or get involved in the conduct of Congress or the conduct of the office of president. We are asking this court to determine whether representations and omissions were false and misleading, and whether the money paid on the basis of those representations, whether folks were injured in a financial sense as a result of those representations, and whether duties to the class members were breached, including fiduciary duties. I think the courts do those types of things all the time. There's nothing inherently political about those determinations. And again, I think this gets back to the theme that they keep putting in front of the court, that there's some type of immunity that comes out of the First Amendment because we're talking about politics and sort of anything goes as far as political speech is concerned. I think it's kind of what their theory bolts down to. That is where we end it. Now, the judge asked to Mr. Spiva, if a person is fraudulently induced to donate to a charitable organization, does he have the standing to sue the person who induced the donation? His answer makes me think that he was trained by Hillary Clinton herself. Mr. Spiva, I think, Your Honor, if the circumstances were such that the organization promised that it was going to abide by some general principle, and the donor ultimately sued because they said, well, we don't think you're living up to that general principle. We don't think you're serving the kids adequately, for example. We think your program is not adequate. You're not doing well enough, that they would not have a standing in that circumstance. Pause. That's not what the judge asked you. The judge asked you, you're saying that if a donor or donee, however you want to say it, donated to a charitable organization and they found that, I don't know, maybe there wasn't really a playground in the orphanage, that they could sue. That's completely different than an organization saying, we have an orphanage, give us your money, but there is no orphanage. That is what the plaintiffs are saying in this case. The DNC said there was impartiality, and we thought Bernie Sanders really had a chance, and we gave money based on that assumption. But they're saying, no, no, no. You have no right to sue at all. Now, Mr. Spiva goes on. The other part of their injury here appears to be that Senator Sanders would have done better had the party supposedly been more even-handed than it was. And then, in terms of concrete injury, in which was really the first prong, that again is problematic. And this goes back to Your Honor's original question. There is no right to, just by virtue of making a donation, to enforce the party's internal rules. And there's no right to not have your candidate disadvantaged or have another candidate advantaged. There's no contractual obligation here. Full stop. There is no right, just by virtue of making a donation, to enforce the party's internal rules. There is no right to not have your candidate disadvantaged or have another candidate advantaged. Open court, people. This is coming from the same guy that said, we could have elected our nominee in a smoke-filled back room. This guy will say anything in open court. He doesn't care. They think they're untouchable. Now, he is going to continue, or we are going to continue, rather. Very far down, because these series of questions are all about case law. So now, the court asked Mr. Beck, what imminent future injury do the plaintiffs allege? Mr. Beck, well, I think that the imminent future injury, and this has sort of, I think, become apparent, perhaps, in the course of today's hearing, but the imminent future injury is that elections occur on a cyclical basis. And so unless the court, if we prove our claims, and unless the court issues a remedy to prevent the DNC from engaging in this type of conduct in the future, there's nothing that's going to be stopping them. Yes, Mr. Beck, I absolutely agree. This is a threat to democracy itself. And I am glad that Mr. Beck can say as many intelligent things in open court as Mr. Spiva can say stupid things. Speaking of Mr. Spiva, let's move right along. We're almost done here. Mr. Spiva, first, I just want to say, because in response to my hypothetical that the party could choose its nominees in a smoke-filled back room, I just want to reiterate that the party ran its process fair and impartially. Pause. Even though the court can't decide what impartial means. Now he's going to bring up the word. We can't define what it means. Don't use the word. Continuing. and does not do that and does not plan to do that. But these, again, are political choices that either party is free to make and are not enforceable by court of law. We continue. And although we are not relying on this for our standing argument, this kind of goes to plausibility. There are statements in the public by some of these class representatives that show there was no reliance and no injury. Some of them even gave money to participate in the lawsuit. We gave our money on the possibility that a judge might rule in our favor against Supreme Court standing precedent. I think Mr. Bruce Spiva thinks we're stupid, but we're not. Last but not least, we have a recess. It's over. The second half of the hearing was basically all case law, current, past, legal jargon. It was a lot of reading. My mom was a paralegal student, but I've never read that much legal jargon in my entire life. But what we have here is a class action lawsuit brought against the DNC to protect what it means to live in a democratic society. And the lawyer for the DNC is claiming that the very basis for our court, even-handedness and impartiality, cannot be defined by the court, and that the DNC and RNC, by virtue of being political parties, are politically immune to the court's justice. Well, my friends, you heard about the precedent case. You heard about the case law in the 80s that gave political parties contractual immunity to their members. And we have 2018 coming up, and we have some choices to make. And I am of two minds. That if you are going to stay in the Democratic Party and you're going to try to reform it, then do your research on Justice Democrats and make sure that you know who you're voting for and you know that they are going to represent you in your honest and natural desire for human rights such as education and health care and child care. If you are done with the Democratic Party, and I know millions, tens of millions of people have left the Democratic Party since the election, and you're part of the Draft Bernie group, stay there. That puts pressure on them. And tell them that you will not come back unless we get a progressive Democratic nominee for 2020. Now, I love Bernie Sanders, of course. I do hope that he runs again in 2020. But you know what I think would be even more awesome? Tulsi Gabbard for president 2020. Bernie Sanders as her vice president. That would be a progressive dream team. And in electing Justice Democrats along with them, we can finally turn our country around and get it back to the democracy it was always supposed to be. Thank you for joining me for Call of the Wild. Soon we will be coming out with videos about Donald Trump, the Russia hysteria, Seth Rich, and many, many more. Thank you for watching. If you like this video and want to see more, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Answer the Call of the Wild.